This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
And we are making a special appeal. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click on it and support us. We are counting on you. In return, every week we'll bring you episodes talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention.
Our guest today is Jonathan Karp. He's an associate professor of history and Judaic studies at Binghamton University in New York. His main research interests are the crossover between Jewish American and Black American intellectual and economic and musical histories. He was recently a guest of Tel Aviv University's Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism in Israel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How did you come to be interested in the topic of Jews and Black Americans, specifically in the music industry? I just have to jump right in there.
Sure. That's goes way back for me when I was reading a book called Honkers and Shouters.
I like it already. It sounds like a bar mitzvah hit.
Yes. History of Rhythm and Blues, written by a man named Arnold Shaw. And I was reading it back when I was a long time ago, when I was an undergraduate. I was working at a radio station, in the college radio station at Tufts University, and was fanatical about all kinds of music. But I loved jazz and rhythm and blues especially. And this was it still is a wonderful resource, Honkers and Shouters. And I just noticed that so many of the people in the music business in the 40s and 50s that Shaw talked about and interviewed were Jews. And it was pretty obvious to me from their names and from the dispositions. I sort of already was attuned to ethnic identities. And I thought rarely had they pointed this fact out. It seemed to be obvious and yet covered up.
I'm wondering if we can work in a joke here about honkies and shouters, or a certain anti-Semitic slur that also sounds similar, which I will not say.
I won't dare to do that, but you're welcome.
We would never do that. But you raise a question about what you yourself raised this question about whether their Jewishness really had anything to do with this. I mean, was their Jewish religion incidental, or was it really a sort of sociological category that led them with their networks and their specific skills coming out of Europe into this business?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. I think it's more the latter, but some of the former. I think that you really can't separate in Jewish history religion from social class. Jews were different in European society. Although there were great variations in economic status among Jews within the Jewish communities of Europe, they were very, very poor Jews. Most Jews were very poor. Nevertheless, rich or poor, they tended to fulfill a set of middleman brokerage functions. Basically operating between the European nobilities and the peasantries, especially in Eastern Europe. And Jews were a kind of alternative burgher class. I won't go through the complicated situation of society in medieval Europe, but the burghers were the townsmen, and they were Christians. And the aristocracy preferred, when possible, to use Jews as their economic agents because they were more pliable, more dependent, more vulnerable, and less powerful. So they could be more conveniently used. And so there's a centuries-long legacy of this. And whether rich or poor, Jews tended to constitute a social class in addition to a religious identity that performed specific functions within European society. That's one of the reasons why Jews were tolerated in European society. I mean, we think the opposite. We think that Jews were persecuted, as they were. But in reality, they were really the only non-Christian element that was permitted to exist in Christian society. And that was partly for theological reasons, but it was also because of the functions that they were able to perform. So when they came to America, they recreated some of this kind of class relationship and functionality within a very different social context, the U.S.
And why does the music industry stand out for you? I mean, how is it different from other industries that they were also played a crucial role in?
Like the schmata trade.
Right. Well, if you're looking at Black-Jewish relationships, then the music industry is more helpful than the schmata trade.
Although they're not entirely disconnected.
They're not entirely disconnected. And as I point out in one of my articles, Jews in New York and the Lower East Side and Jews in the East End of London were involved in the clothing business and the schmata trade, clothing manufacturing, and in both cases, oddly enough, that led for some into the entertainment industry. The presentational quality, the focus on fashion and presentation were in some way related. So entrepreneurship was the real common denominator, but the paths through which Jews came from one set of more mundane kinds of businesses like clothing manufacturing or used furniture or some other kind of factory production into the record business are fascinating. So you could certainly do a study of the economic history of Jews in the U.S. or Britain without focusing too much on the entertainment business. But if you're looking at interethnic and interracial relations, particularly between blacks and Jews, that is a key nexus.
Well, actually, let me jump in, because is there another sociological factor that's not so much about the Jewish history, but about both Jews and blacks being marginalized communities who, are involved in the creation of a particular form of music that starts with marginalization? Can you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they understand each other.
Yeah, and that's usually how the relationship is portrayed, that they have a kind of affinity, a kind of natural sympathy based on a common history of persecution. I don't at all deny that. I think it's really important, but I think it's been emphasized sufficiently. And I think that this kind of more nuts and bolts class relationship hasn't been brought forth adequately. So that's what I'm trying to do. I don't want to ignore the other part. And I think what has to be understood is that black music was attractive to many different groups in American society. Before there were large numbers of Jews living in 19th century America, the Irish, the Germans, even WASPs, if you will, were really interested in black music. The minstrel show, which was the main form of entertainment in 19th century America, was about white Europeans, people of white European descent, imitating, emulating, making fun of, admiring black culture and particularly black music. So black music was already a highly valued commodity.
But despite that, the market was limited in a way to black consumers to the point where they called it race records.
It goes back and forth. So you're jumping ahead 100 years to the 1940s and 1950s.
Sorry.
That's all right. It's a complicated, labyrinthine story, but we find in different periods of American cultural history that black music or imitations of black music ebb and flow in their popularity and in the desire of white people to appropriate them and listen to them. In the period that you just mentioned, with the small little indie record labels that like Chess and Savoy Records and King Records all over the country that were almost invariably Jewish-owned labels producing black music by black musicians for black consumers. That's a particular chapter, if you will, in this long story, which is really a century-long story. And it's a fairly late chapter, but that's right. Nobody, or very few, there were some black-owned record companies. They were really shoestring operations, and the Jews were not the majors, but they were somewhere in between the shoestring black-owned companies and the big established major record companies, and they could take talent that had already been pioneered and discerned and cultivated to a degree by these little black labels, and they could take them to the next level. And eventually, if these musicians were successful enough, they'd be picked up by the majors.
You said that Irish Americans and German Americans were ubiquitous in the industry in the 19th century and, later subsumed by the Jews. Where did they go? Where did the Irish Americans and German Americans go?
The Irish
when the Jews
Americans
arrived?
became cops.
It's true. It's true. There's some truth to different...
And what accounts to the sea change within the industry?
Okay, so I think that's a really important question because it seems like every ethnic group had their moment of engagement with black culture and being, in a sense, the mediaries of black culture or intermediaries of black culture. But Jews endured far longer. In fact, when the Jews came into the picture, they never left the picture. And that's the difference with the Irish, with the Italians, with the Germans, with other groups. So there is a sort of interesting theory that minstrelsy, where white musicians and performers put on blackface makeup and ridicule, but also emulate and satirize black culture. It's a big phenomenon. I mentioned it a moment ago, minstrelsy. So the theory, the sort of academic theory is that this is a way of affirming one's white identity. Ironically, you put on the black makeup, but then you take it off, whereas African Americans can't take off their black makeup. And I think that this is a superficial analysis.
I was just going to say what an interesting analysis it is.
It is interesting.
Anthropologists could have a great time with this.
It has a grain of truth to it, but at the same time you have to account for the fact that there were many African American performers who also put on blackface. So when they took off the blackface, they were still black. So if the whole point is whitening, then how does that work in that case? In the Jewish case, Jews never stopped. So with the Irish, with the Germans, you could say that once they made it, in a sense, once they had established their bona fides as whites, in some sense, they didn't need the blackface anymore. They had grown out of it. It had served its purpose. With Jews, one form or another of blackface persisted through the present day, even in the hip-hop era, where we find the same phenomenon of Jewish brokerage and entrepreneurship, of hip-hop and rap music that I could describe the period of the race music, indie record labels of the 1940s and 1950s. So it's more of a permanent relationship, and I think that that's the reason for that is this class understanding, that unlike the Irish and the Germans and the Italians, Jews were entrepreneurs. And this became, like with the Irish and the cops or the Italians and the construction industry, this became a Jewish-identified industry, the entertainment industry and particularly the music industry.
But it's not always a flattering relationship. I mean, obviously, the image of Jews in the entertainment industry, especially when it comes to black music, yes, they were one among the intermediaries who brought it into mass white culture, but also possibly exploitative, somewhat the image of swindlers, cheats, and of course maybe the towering, notorious figure of Alan Klein in the music industry. And you can tell us who he is and why he kind of epitomizes this less comfortable, convenient image of a not such nice relationship.
Well, if you're familiar with The Sopranos, many in your audience will be, there's a character on The Sopranos called Hesh, who is an occasional character. He's a Jewish music company or a record company label owner. And he's modeled on a real person named Morris Levy, who had a company called Roulette Records, had many record companies, was a notorious figure. He was really a mafiosi. He was kind of an honorary member of the Gambino crime family. And,
I remember the Gambinos in the 80s.
That's right. So that's why he's in The Sopranos. And there's an episode involving a rap artist named Massive Genius. That's his stage name. And he's suing Hesh for exploiting and stealing from all of these great pioneering black artists of the 1950s and 60s. And Hesh and Tony Soprano confer, and they don't know what to do to deal with this character. He represents a real challenge and a real threat. Eventually, Hess outsmarts him by countersuing on the basis of Massive Genius's interpolations and samplings of all of these records over which Hess has the copyrights.
And let me guess, somebody said this episode was anti-Semitic.
Probably, but
but is it historical?
The character, it is. I mean, the Massive Genius part is not historical, but the Hesh figure based on Morris Levy is. So let me cut back to the first question you asked, or one of the first questions, why did I become interested in this topic in the first place? I became interested in it because, to me, it epitomizes it captures some of the moral ambiguity of the unique relationship between blacks and Jews, which extends beyond the music business. There is a powerful element of facilitating black advancement and integration and promoting black culture, and there is an element of exploitation.
And appropriation.
Right? And so you have both, and it's really hard morally, ethically to untangle those elements. And I think that's great in a way. That's great intellectually. That's great analytically, because it helps me to understand, that this is a complex, variegated, gray, not black and white sort of relationship.
So when in your later work you focus on Jewish historians as chroniclers of the Black American experience, is it just a natural emanation of that? Is it really the same kind of inquiry?
It is similar. It's a kind of analogous relationship of Jewish intellectuals, historians, academics, describing and analyzing the Black American experience and interpreting it to the broader white American public. But here I think that some of the motivations are different. Some of the motivations of these historians are not really to make money as they are for the record company owners.
Different endeavor.
That's a different endeavor. But here the dominant influence is the leftism of Jews coming out of Eastern European socialism and the labor movements in America in the early parts of the century. But even when you have ideological motivations for being interpreters of black culture, the functional relationship is quite similar. There were black intellectuals, they were great black historians, but they couldn't get jobs at universities. Jews had some trouble getting jobs at universities in the middle decades of the 20th century, but they had, as nominal white people, they had far more access to mainstream institutions. So they could again serve as brokers and interpreters of the black experience.
Is that why you mentioned some of these black intellectuals from the early 20th century, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson? So they were pioneering, but they were so few and far between because of those structural influences. They had to pass the baton somehow to a different kind of people to make, to ensure that their field thrives.
Precisely. I think we have to think of America before the 1960s as an apartheid society. Yes, it's not exactly identical to the South African situation, certainly not, but it's really a segregated society. So black intellectuals, for the most part, just simply do not have the opportunities to publish, to convey their messages. A good example, you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a classic reinterpretation of the post-Civil War experience, and he really revised our understanding of that period, of the period of 1870s and 1880s, seeing it as a extraordinarily revolutionary period in American culture and society. But his study was ignored entirely.
Wait, don't tease us here. You're talking about the souls of black folk?
No, I'm talking about a later work. So Reconstruction is the period right after the Civil War, when the North controls the South and tries to impose, not just to end the legacy of slavery, but to impose an egalitarian order on the American South through force, coercively. The way it was understood in later American society is epitomized by the film Gone with the Wind. So there you have carpetbaggers and exploiters and black characters who are caricatures, and it's seen in a very, very negative light. Du Bois came along in the 1920s, and he wrote a history of black Reconstruction in which he completely revised the understanding of what had taken place and gave it a completely different cast. But his scholarship wasn't really incorporated into mainstream academic historical scholarship until the 1960s and 1970s. And it was Jewish scholars who performed that role. Du Bois never got the credit that he deserved for really being the pioneer and making the correct reinterpretation.
Until much later.
Until much later. So that's another case where Jews are not necessarily adding much creatively, but they are reinforcing messages and information that African Americans are telling about themselves, but not succeeding in reaching an audience.
But I want to ask, you called it potentially sort of an ideological interest in advancing this, but doesn't this also possibly go back to what I called before the sociological position? Jews as the outsiders, the minorities struggling for their rights, isn't that what drove them to these ideologies of more universal liberation and, to research these kinds of histories?
Yes, absolutely. But I think a common fallacy is to assume that Judaism, Jewish culture, the Jewish religion is inherently for the outsider, is inherently left-wing, is inherently, messianic, but it's not. If you were to look back in previous centuries, you would see that first of all, Jews were more often than not tied to the power structure. They were agents of the elites. They weren't agents, or they weren't advocates for the downtrodden. And it's really not, in my opinion, and people will differ, but it's really not part and parcel of rabbinic Judaism. It has roots in biblical Judaism. It's true, kind of.
No, I was going to say no argument for me, but then again, But this does go back to another. I'm sorry to bring it back to the musical question, but there's an interesting overlap because there are two important Jews whose big sort of subversive network or subcultural network was not actually as much based on their Judaism as their combination of being both Jews and homosexuals, Brian Epstein and Andrew Oldham. So it's almost like it was this double outsider thing and really not so much related to any sort of Jewish theology. These are not exactly religious Jews, although didn't one of them grow up sort of religious? Anyway, it seems much more that they were in a subculture network.
Absolutely.
That helps them break in.
Absolutely. So,
and for anybody who doesn't know, we're talking about the Beatles managers and the Stones managers.
Right. I was wanted to compare Jewish music entrepreneurs in the U.S. and the UK in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. I knew enough about it to think that there was a story to be told there. But in the U.S., obviously, the product that Jews are marketing is black music. It's rhythm and blues music.
Which the Stones, of course, kind of reinterpret. And
That's right. But there isn't a sizable black population in the UK in the 1950s and 1960s. So who are the outsiders that the Jews are whose work Jews and whose cultural products Jews are brokering, Jews are marketing, Jews are selling? It's the British working class. So the British working class plays an analogous role to African Americans in a society like Britain, which is much more rigid class structure than in the U.S., where race plays a much less important role. It's more racially homogenous. Race isn't the same kind of category in Britain. It's not to say that there wasn't colonialism and racism in Britain, but
they invented it.
Class was really the crucial category within British society. And so the products, the creations of the British working class, which came to real fruition through the British invasion, through the development of music in Britain, of popular music in Britain in the 50s and 1960s, that was the sort of counterpart to African American musical products in America. And Jews served as brokers of both. It's a complicated story. There are a lot of strands that weave in and out, and it's also a story that matches up. In other words, what Jews are doing in the U.S. with black music and Anglo-Jews are doing in London and Liverpool and Manchester with white working-class British music comes together through the creation of a transatlantic interchange of music.
Basically through the Rolling Stones.
The Rolling Stones, exactly.
I want to go back 70 or 80 years.
Okay, we're jumping around a lot.
Yeah. No, going back to the
time
first
travel, musical
to the first
and racial
generation
time
of Jews in the music industry in America, in
Yes.
some rural places as well.
Right.
Was it really the first sphere in which Jews and blacks interacted in a meaningful way. And I'm asking this because it ties again to the story of the historians, the Jewish historians of the Black American experience, who came perhaps a generation or two afterwards. So perhaps some of them weren't the direct descendants of these first generation of Jews, but they were, you could say that they represented later generations of Jews after they moved up the social ladder and, were upwardly mobile. The parents were business people, small-time business people, and their children became college-educated intellectuals who could transform that into livelihood. So would you say that, this interaction started within the music industry and later became, this same kind of dynamic replicated itself in other spheres, such as history?
There was no plan. It didn't start off with a plan. In the music business, first of all, you really have Jews. You mentioned the areas outside of New York, small-town America. Jews had come in the 19th century basically from Central Europe. Sometimes they're referred to as German Jews. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but they're mostly Central European Jews. They're coming in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and they're not settling overwhelmingly in New York as later waves of Jewish migration would. They're settling in small towns. They're peddlers. They're building local stores, general stores. And so they're suppliers to the local farming community. Again, this intermediary role. And that actually provides a foundation for Jews to enter into the world of theater chains, theater ownership, booking agencies. So by the 1880s, coming out of these small-town peddler roots, Jews are among those, not the only ones, but among those who have established a real infrastructure of the entertainment business, making it into a real capitalist industry. That's already in place when the black commodity comes along and becomes the commodity of the moment, and Jews jump on the bandwagon. I mentioned that there were other groups who were already involved in it. So that happens around 1900, I would say. And Tin Pan Alley, which is the sheet music publishing industry, which is centered in New York, but which draws Jewish businessmen from all over the country, starts to focus increasingly on writing and publishing black-styled songs like Alexander's Ragtime Band and many, many others. I am getting to your question. So what we really have is a very long legacy of Jews being, first of all, involved in the building of an infrastructure of a capitalist entertainment industry. Second of all, specializing or making a special focus on merchandising and marketing black music or black-styled music. And then you have that's already established with the earlier waves of Jewish immigration from Central Europe. When you have the mass immigration from Eastern Europe, those Eastern European Jews who are imbued with an ideological motive to identify with the underdog, they already have a business infrastructure that they can plug into, that their co-religionists from Central Europe have already built. And so, again, it's a story that really goes on for at least 100 years. It starts in the late 19th century and it goes up through the present. Now,
but in the present, it's no longer sort of these indie and marginal. Right. They've sort of taken over the biggest towering companies.
And Jews also built Hollywood. That's also a big part of the story. Coming out of this entertainment, theatrical infrastructure, booking, etc., Hollywood in the 19-teens and 1920s became a Jewish industry.
And if you think about Walter Yetnikoff, they no longer have to change their names.
That's right. That's right. So there was a cover-up of Jewishness for a long time among many. But it's really a layered story, intergenerational, multi-generational story. I mean, the part, Gilad, that I think plugs into your question most obviously is that in some cases it's the children and grandchildren of the indie record label owners who were rough and ready, tough guys. The Chess brothers were sons of a junkyard dealer. I mean, they were really working-class ruffians who saw an opportunity and seized it, and in some cases made a fortune out of it. But their sons, their children, their grandchildren went to college, became professionals, and then went into the music industry and helped to be the entrepreneurial brokers of the latest, or the more recent incarnation of black popular music, which became hip-hop and rap music. So that takes you all the way into the 80s and the 90s. So whereas with the schmata business, which Dahlia, you mentioned a while ago, I mean, we don't find too many Jews in the schmata business anymore.
No, but we do
York.
Find Jews as erstwhile
fashion.
owners of major fashion companies.
That's true. That's true, but
similar progress in a way, it seems like, from the music industry.
Yeah, you're right, and you're right to correct me on that. But I guess my point was going to be that unlike the marked off or knockoff fashion business, the music business has an allure. It has a mystique that I think helped to make it enduringly attractive to Jews, even when they became college-educated, professional, and might have had other opportunities in life. It still attracted them. So it's a story that really continues at least to the end of the 20th century.
Can I point out my favorite anecdote from this story, from your
Sure,
work?
please.
Where you talk about Don Arden, who got his start acting as an agent for booking acts for Western forces stationed in post-war Germany, and the German agents couldn't get any of the Jewish talent managers to take their call. And I like to quote you. You said the U.S. soldiers would ask for Elvis and end up with Fritz the local yodeler and his dancing bear. And that, to my mind, is a great little anecdote of sort of this sociological transition of Jews starting out of necessity as outsiders and marginalized, and kind of finding this niche for themselves that helps them be the gatekeeper for the great, forces that really want them, and then, of course, becoming major commercial and, all the baggage that goes along with it. It's an interesting sort of moment in the rise and, I shouldn't say rise and fall, but rise and continue
Rise and rise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that ethnicity is really important in understanding business in capitalist societies. There's a kind of assumption that with capitalism, there's a decline of ethnicity and ethnic identification. But the fact is that when you have ethnic networks, it really gives you a leg up. It gives you an advantage. And even Jews who were in some ways otherwise assimilated or certainly non-religiously affiliated, nevertheless, their cousins, brother-in-laws, contacts that they made because they went to a summer camp or, went to a school or went to college together or whatever it was, these became the fabric of Jewish-dominated industries, especially in the fields of entertainment and music.
All right, and on this note, I'd like to thank...
On this note!
I'd like to thank Fritz the Yodeler and Dr. Jonathan Karp for coming in today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, Itai Shalem, our producer, and the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. And now a small request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And please, please, please consider writing us a review, hopefully a positive one. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks for you. Check out our archive with some 500 interviews in it. And if you like what we do here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.